I do not count the hours I spend in wandering by the sea. A forest is my loyal friend, a Delphic shrine to me. Ralph Waldo Emerson. Welcome to this week's episode of Warfare, Advancement, and Revisionism. My name is Preston Floyd, and as always, I'm your host. I'd like to thank you all for joining me this week. I appreciate the support. If you're a newcomer, welcome. I hope you will peruse our backlog of episodes, and to all of my returning listeners, again, thank you guys so much. As always, I really appreciate your continued support. It does mean a lot. So if you would all be so kind as to please rate 5 stars, download, like, subscribe, whatever you do on your platform of choice to support your creators of choice, I ask you do the same to me, or for me, I should say. So this week, we will be talking about the material cultures of the Baltic between the years of 6 and 4000 BC, BCE, whichever of those two naming schema you prefer. And we will also probably get to the British Isles and begin to discuss life on it, and of course that includes Ireland as well. So probably another couple of weeks here in Europe before we move over to the Americas. And once we're done with those, we'll be in season 5, I guess. And we're going to be redoing kind of how things are organized at that point. But I'll give you guys a little bit more details on that later. Before all that, though, I do need to bring up one material culture that emerges during the season in what is now Germany and Denmark that I did not discuss last week. And I meant to mention them and why I wasn't really going to be going in depth into this culture much this season, and why I'm kind of holding them off to the next time we're in Europe. But that is the funnel beaker culture, or the funnel neck beaker culture, or the TRB, or the TBK, depending on if you use the German or Dutch or Danish, I guess, also abbreviation. In German, it's the Trichteren Becherkultur. In Dutch, it's the Trichterbekerkultur. And in Danish, it's Tragtebekerkultur. I'm sorry to all my Danish listeners and any other really Scandinavian listeners I may have. I know I've got a couple in Sweden. I know I got a couple in Finland as well, and I think 1 or 2 in Norway have listened. Apologies for butchering a sister tongue of yours as well. I didn't discuss the funnel beaker, even though technically they do emerge right around 4,300. Give or take. That date's not 100% in stone. Some people do put them as late as 4000 BC. Though I think more recently they have been pushed back by most scientists about 4,300, 4,200. And the reason I'm not really discussing them is that they are an extremely long-lasting culture. They're going to last from your starting period, which again, a few small snites emerged this season. It's not a lot. And then they will go to about 2,800 BC. So quite a long-lasting culture in what is now Germany, the Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, and also parts of Poland, and I believe Austria and Czechia as well. So we will be discussing them next season. We're going to go in much more in depth. I'm just not discussing them too much because, again, their origins are a little debated, and they may not even have really kind of been their own thing until even a couple hundred years in past 4,000. That's certainly when like their pottery style becomes really evident. And really begins to stand out. So that's part of the reason I'm not covering them. But you can kind of trace their origins to a mix of peoples left over at the old Lingil sites, as well as the STK and the Rossen peoples. They're kind of an amalgamation of those three groups, and they kind of forge their own, well, not necessarily identity, because we don't know how they identified, but they kind of begin to share a pottery making tradition amongst themselves. And then later, of course, they receive people moving north from the Mickelsburg culture, as well as absorbing and spreading this pottery style to the peoples living in Scandinavia and the Netherlands, or at the very least they displace those people living there. But we'll get into that next season. So, and I meant to kind of include that as kind of the cap on Germany last week, but I forgot to do it. And if you read the notes from last week's episode, you would have seen my note about that. I realized, you idiot, you forgot to talk about that as I was getting the YouTube episode edited last week. So that was my bad. Also, I said I called the Baltic the Balkans a couple of times last week, which at the time I was like, oh man, why did I do that? I also put a note in there in the episode description for last week. I put that note in there too. So apologies for mixing up the Balkans and the Baltic twice. Now, I should also go ahead and say at the outset that this includes basically areas bordering the Baltic Sea, kind of in Eastern Europe, as well as some of Scandinavia, specifically Finland, and not so much Scandinavia, which does border partially the Baltic Sea. So basically, we're going to be talking about places that are in modern-day countries like Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, Finland, Russia, as well as I think also parts of Belarus as well. Just keep that in mind, essentially. But yeah, and most of the cultures we'll be discussing are Mesolithic, though some of them do begin to adopt the Neolithic lifestyle, or at least parts of the Neolithic lifestyle. These are fairly long-lasting cultures. They're kind of on the outskirts of where you would see like farming really taking off in Europe, and they'll continue even as farming begins to spread. They'll basically last in parallel with Neolithic groups, even as some of them begin to adopt more and more aspects of Neolithic lifestyles. But we'll get to that here in just a moment. The first culture we'll be discussing is the Yanosławica culture. And this is mostly concentrated in Poland, though I think some of their territory does get into Belarus and I think parts of what are now Russia. And it had a kind of three regional kind of subgroups, though there is a debate whether, hey, maybe these are, there are some similarities, but they might actually be considered their own culture. But that's all, again, debated. And this is one of the cultures I was having harder times finding sources in English, so apologies for that. But they lived around, they made their homes around kind of river terraces, not directly on the rivers, but kind of in elevated positions around fairly large rivers. There's the Witska group, which was primarily located along the Vistula River basin. Today, it would have kind of occupied the stretch of the Vistula between Warsaw, Poland, and Torun, Poland. And they also had some sites along the Narwu and the Bug rivers, as well as a couple of others. Then you have the Eastern group. They were primarily concentrated around the Niemen Basin, as well as the Upper Pripyat River, as well as parts of the Narwu and Bug, as you might expect. This is kind of the middle ground between the Witska group and the Eastern group. They also were very near what is now Krakow. In fact, they occupied an area known as the Krakow Gate, and this is a natural rock formation, and it's kind of one of the big. It was, and I believe kind of still is, like one of the only land routes between the region of Krakow and Silesia. So this was a very important trade route for quite a period of time. Of course, now with automobiles, trains, that kind of thing, it's obviously lost some of its significance, but for most of history, this was a pathway that you would need to travel. It would be much easier to travel through that gate than having to go through around the coast and then down rivers that way. And trade's going to be very important to this group, as we will see. And finally, you have the Mocassimons group, and I'm sure I butchered that. They were primarily around the Niemen and the Birbza River. They were more closely connected to the Eastern group, whereas the Eastern group and the Witska group are closer neighbors, and some of their sites, kind of in that overlapping region, do share similarities between both. The Maximones group is kind of, while they had trade links with the Eastern group, they are more, there's less similarities, and they're a little bit further away, so that does make sense. And in fact, when I talked about some people thinking that maybe they should be separate cultures, the Maximones group is one that gets a lot more support in that regard. That maybe they were their own separate culture, and they would have been kind of in the kind of today on kind of the eastern side of Poland, closer to what is the border between Poland and Belarus, as well as Poland and Lithuania. And this culture lasts between probably about 6,000 BC to about, some date it to about 4,000, some date it to about 3,000, or at least some of their sites to about 3,000. But as you might expect, starting around 4,500 to about 4,000, their sites begin to shrink or undergo changes as they begin to adopt more Neolithic aspects to their lifestyle. And this is primarily influenced by contact with the Funnelbeaker peoples in what is now Germany, as well as the globular amphora culture, who we'll discuss. They haven't come up yet, as well as from people from the steppes to the kind of southeast. Their economy is entirely based on hunting, fishing, and gathering, again, until some people maybe start to adopt, herding or agriculture. But again, that really doesn't happen until about the midway point, so about 4,500 or later. They're very good craftsmen when it comes to flint. Almost all of their tools that they use are made from some variety of flint. Of course, they do have bone and antler tools, but those don't always show up in the record very well compared to flint. But flint mining is very important to them, and they provide this for trade to several cultures on their borders, including some we'll be talking about here shortly. But as time goes on, flint becomes less important. Once copper enters the stage, and then later bronze, they do begin to kind of, you see their sites slowly begin to lose importance and influence, and then they begin to adopt new lifestyles. And that stuff we'll deal with later. Their homes are in kind of dugout or semi-dugout dwellings, lowered floors, and then covered with, depending on the time frame, wood or wattle and daub, animal hides, all that kind of stuff. They did practice burial for their dead. I think they primarily have just found males, but I couldn't tell if that was the only thing they have found or if the males are just more prevalent. But the males are the only ones that I saw specifically mentioned as having a large amount of grave goods. One individual had quite a collection of grave goods. He had around 21 different types of microliths and blades, as well as a necklace made of animal teeth and bone and antler tools. The other burials do have, necklaces and things like that, but not as many blades are found with all individuals. So this person may just have been very, well skilled at creating tools and things like that. So they gave him those as kind of just to kind of show his skill. But all of their burials do have red ochre placed in the graves with the individuals. And the flint that they're producing is being traded. Far south, they found it in the Dnieper River Basin, which we've talked about those groups earlier this season. There's a very big draw and demand for flint to their south, so it was probably fairly profitable for them. But of course, as copper and other metals became, desired, the demand for flint probably failed off, which again is probably part of the reason that they begin to evolve out of this specific, cultural phase. Also, I believe the genetics on this is a little hard to nail down, but it seems like they are a mix of Western hunter-gatherer and Eastern hunter-gatherers. However, it does look like they have more genetics in common with Western hunter-gatherers, something like 60 to 70%, whereas there's only about 30% or so of Eastern hunter-gatherers in the DNA of the ones they've been able to test. Obviously, that could be different for some of these people, but this is just what we have from the testable DNA. Another culture bordering on this one is known as the Neman culture. And this is also along the Neman River, although they are more coastal than the Yanoswawits. And they kind of curve right around the Baltic. And they do go inland some, kind of basically following what is today the border between Latvia and Lithuania, as well as parts of the very north of Poland. And historically, I think they also occupy part of what is known as Pomerania. And this name comes from the Neman River, also known as the Memel River, also sometimes referred to as the Nemanus in Lithuanian, as well as the Neoman in Belarusian. Today it's N-E-M-A-N in Russian, and Poland it's N-I-E-M-E-N. The name means something like wet place or just moist, or it could just be like a river. It could be another term for river. At least that's the origin if you think the name comes from Baltic. There are those that also think it could be a Finnic language word it's coming from something like Naimi, which means cape, which, this is kind of right on the cape, the coast, right off the Baltic Sea. Now, this culture emerges about 5,100, and it goes to about 2000 BC. So it does overlap with the Yanoswawits. And this culture is, first, it's a Mesolithic culture. They carry on the tradition of having larger stone tools, these macroliths, but they slowly begin to incorporate Mesolithic, microlithic stone tools into their repertoire as time goes on. And they're mainly hunting reindeer, elk, things like that, at least initially. And they're pretty nomadic. They're traveling up and down the coast, as well as up and down the Neman River, as well as the rivers that feed into that. They are kind of competing with the Yanoswawits culture for control of, well, not necessarily control of, but they are also heavy traders in flint, especially with a group to their north that we'll talk about shortly, known as the Narva culture, as well as they're trading flint with peoples to their west. Another aspect of Neolithic lifestyle, or at least what most people would kind of associate with Neolithic, is the creation of pottery. They do develop their own type of pottery. It's clay with crushed in quartzite, though they would also sometimes put in plants to kind of thicken the clay, usually straw, stuff like that. So they were creating their own clay. They would basically do most of it, with just bog standard brown clay, though they would mix in a thin layer of white clay on the surface, and then they would imprint small rows around the brims of their vessels. And I do have some reconstructions of those. Not too many have the white kind of lining, at least the reconstructions don't. Those tend to be black or brown. The reconstructed Neiman does. But I also have some cross sections with those that I'll try to put up in the YouTube episode. But aside from those aspects, they really don't, aside from the tools and the pottery, they really don't adapt much more of the Neolithic lifestyle. But because they're mobile, they really don't get absorbed. They last a lot longer than the Yaroslawicz does. They last again till about 2000 BC. But again, once the breakdown of flint trading happens, they do drop in numbers, or at least their sites aren't as common, but they do hang on until, again, right around 2000 BC, where they're kind of pushed out by other cultures. Some we've discussed, I think, in the past. Corded ware, I've mentioned them, but they're one of the big ones, the globular amphora culture, as well as the funnel beaker, or the TBK culture, as well as some other local Polish subcultures that we'll get into next season. Now, we're going to move north and discuss the next, I guess, kind of Mesolithic culture, also made up of hunter-gatherers. And this is known as the Kunda culture. And that comes from the type site, which is in Kunda, Estonia. And again, this is a Mesolithic culture. They're hunter-gatherers. They're very big on hunting elk, reindeer, that kind of thing. We talked about them a little bit last season because they are a very long-lasting culture. They last between 8,500 and about 5,000 BC. Most of their tools are bone-related, bone or antler, and they also fish as well as hunting. And most of what we found from them are their fish hooks and things like that, as well as the bone tools that they're making from elk. And one of the reasons they're making so much with bone and antler is because they really don't have access to a lot of quality stone. And that's going to kind of play into their succeeding culture, and this is known as the Narva culture, and we'll get to them in just a moment. But the Kunda culture, they are in a very heavily forested area, and they are descended from probably the first people who began to move into Estonia after the end of the last glacial maximum. So they're really forging into kind of these virgin forests as the temperature begins to warm up. So a lot of abundance in the area, but it's still very wild and untamed land. And they're making a good living off the hunting and gathering in the area, but it's probably not very easy. And their population density probably is not extremely high. Very similar to those Mesolithic cultures we discussed living in Denmark and Sweden last episode. Also, genetically speaking, they are also a mix between Eastern and Western hunter-gatherers, though, again, they do have more genetic kinship with the Western hunter-gatherers as opposed to the Eastern hunter-gatherers. Now, about 5,300, give or take 100 years in one way or the other, some of the Kunda peoples begin to develop a new kind of cultural makeup. And this is again known as the Narva culture. The name comes from the Narva River, also known as the Narwa or the Narova River. And this river it's kind of on the border region of Estonia and Russia in the modern day. The exact etymology of the river is not 100% clear. People think it's related to the Veps or the Vepsian language, which is a Finnic member of the Finnic language family, and it might mean something like waterfall or stream. There's also some thought that could be related to a Proto-Germanic word, narwas, which meant something like narrow or straight, though most people don't agree with that etymology. Now, the Narva culture was more sedentary than the preceding Kunda culture, but they're still fairly mobile, and they still are hunter-gatherers almost entirely. They don't, again, have access to a lot of flint, which is a huge problem. What flint we have found at their sites, you can tell that they're very frugal with flint. They would conserve it as much as possible. They would reuse it. If it broke, they would try and reshape it and basically use it until it could not be used anymore. They also, of course, use bone, horn. They did use some local stone, schist, which is not, I guess, the best. It's not as easy to manipulate as flint is and to shape. But they're very much in demand for flint. And one of the things that they trade for flint with the Neman culture, as well as other peoples to their south and east, is amber. Amber is very sought after, and this continues in the area for quite some time. The amber trade, the amber road, that is going to become a major trade highway in history. And it will come down, and it will be one of the sources of wealth for several peoples and cultures arising in the Baltic area as well as Scandinavia. And they appear, at least from what we've been able to find so far, that basically the only thing that they really want to trade for is flint. Now, they could have also been trading for foodstuffs and things like that, but obviously that wouldn't show up as well as in the archaeological record. But almost no goods produced by another material culture show up in the Narva sites. But you do find Narva goods in Neman sites, as well as other neighboring cultures. So the Narva are they're basically starved for this material that they very much need to be successful hunter-gatherers. It's one of their driving factors in basically staying alive is access to flint and things like that. They're trading amber. They're also trading things they're making from horns. They found carved elk horns that would come from the region. Basically, any kind of animal byproduct that they're able to export. They probably were exporting. Now, they do begin to produce their own types of pottery, which, that would be one less thing they'd have to trade for, being able to produce their own. They are mixing, again, clay with straw, things like that, as well as crushed snail shells. And they typically made vessels that were very large and utilitarian. And they wouldn't do too much decoration, though some of them do have decorations around the rim. And they use basically a very large-scale coiling method. Basically, they would use strips of clay between 6 to 9 centimeters, which is like 2.5 to 3.5 inches, and they would kind of coil that and make these large pointed-in vessels. Now, when the Narva culture ends is debated. It used to be thought that they disappeared right around the time the corded ware culture comes about, which again, we'll talk more about them next season, which the absolute latest, the Narva would have been, if they did indeed end during that period, would have been about 2,300, give or take. And now they could have died out before then, because the corded ware lasts about 1,300 years. About 700 years. Sorry, I did my math wrong in my head. But more recently, they have found Narva-type pottery dated to later periods. We're talking the end of the Bronze Age, which would put it in 1700 BC. Again, give or take a little while. So at least some elements of the Narva culture continue on as mobile hunter-gatherers or semi-mobile hunter-gatherers for quite some time. Now, how that fits into the modern people in the area, that's all very heavily debated. There's a question is, are these people speaking a Finno-Ugaritic language or a Finno-Uralic language? Are they speaking a kind of indigenous European language that we have no trace of? How do they fit into the rise of the Baltic tribes that we have in the historical periods? All of this is heavily debated, and we really don't know. We'll talk more about that here shortly because we have another culture to get to, but no one really knows for sure. I definitely think they contributed some type of their lineage to these succeeding cultures. How that played into that culture's identity, though, I have no idea. So we'll continue on with the next culture, and then we'll check back in on that topic and see if maybe we have makes it a little bit clearer for you. But for me, I honestly don't know. Though I will say, according to linguists, there are some toponyms and hydronyms for some places in the area that do not have a Finno-Uralic or Indo-European language as their basis. Though, again, some of that's debated, and it is one of those things, again, that people are going to continue to kind of debate about, probably until the lights go out, as it were. But just keep all that in mind. We don't know, again, how much they're contributing to these later Baltic tribesmen, or if maybe this next culture is the primary force behind the Finno-Uralic languages in the area. And that next culture, and the last culture that we're going to be covering this week for the Baltic, is the comb ceramic culture, or the CCC, also sometimes called the pit comb ware culture, or the PCW. And this culture is said to exist between 4,200 and 2,000. So we're not going to cover all of them this week, just the first couple of hundred years, and what kind of makes them unique. And one of those things is their pottery. And as you might guess from the name, comb have something to do with their pottery. They have these little waves and dashes kind of incised in their potteries outside, as well as some of them do have these dots incised as well. So they'll have a row of dots, a row of these comb markings, and then another row of dots, or several rows of combs between rows of dots. So they have a couple of different varieties that they choose. Now, these people are also hunter-gatherers. Again, more stationary than the Narva or the Kunda, but still semi-mobile, or at least seasonally mobile. And one of the big things that makes them different is what they're using to make their pottery. They have what's known as asbestos ware. And yes, asbestos is that is what you're thinking of. It is a naturally occurring fibrous silicate mineral. And of course, it is toxic and carcinogenic. So they probably had some health issues, at least the people making their pottery did. And this type of pottery will actually be used in the area and in Finland and basically this entire section of the Baltic for quite some time into the future. Now, they would have overlapped with the Narva in some areas along the coast, but they would be also in southern Finland, and they would essentially have sites all along that kind of southern part of Finland touching the Baltic, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and they would have some sites going all the way to the Ural Mountains. Now, those groups living along the coast, they begin to develop kind of a maritime aspect to their lives, and they begin to specialize in hunting for seals in those areas, as well as hunting, gathering, and fishing, hunting elk and reindeer, and gathering the local plants and fishing in those rivers and ponds and lakes. Now, their settlements were very communal. Most of their people would probably be living in what's Sami people call the lavu, and I hope I'm not butchering that, but it's a fairly large rectangular building. They're ranged around probably about 30 square meters, and about 15 people could live in them at a time. And eventually they do begin to build these out of timber, but early ones were probably made with less sturdy wood and wattle and daub and that kind of thing. In addition to making bone and antler tools, they would also use flint, which they were trading for flint to people in what is now Russia. They were getting their flint from further east than the Narva culture was. They are also getting slate and quartz. They were getting slate from places in Scandinavia, and their asbestos would be coming from places in Finland, and they were also getting slate from parts of Russia as well, or what is now Russia. I think it's the Lake Onega region in Russia. Now, they do have some other cultural stuff that I want to talk about. However, I think we'll call it here for now for this group, because they do, again, last quite a while. They, again, last till about 2000 BC. So we'll keep track of them, because they are going to kind of influence some of this neighboring and succeeding cultures next season that we're going to talk about. And I had planned to move into Britain, but I also didn't think it would take this long to record the stuff I had. So I'm going to go ahead and call this episode now, and we'll get back to the British Isles next week, and that'll probably be 2 to 3 parts, I would imagine. I don't think I'll get through all of that in one go, but we'll see. But I do want to thank you, everyone, again for coming out. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you have any questions, comments, constructive criticism, please let me know. You can reach me at waradrevpod@gmail.com. You can contact me via direct message on X/Twitter, or you can comment on any of my YouTube videos, and I will respond there as best I can. Thank you all for joining me. We actually had snow here this weekend, which is a bit of a surprise. After that kind of false start last week, I didn't think we'd get any in my area, but then kind of the middle part of last week, or this past week, they're like, yeah, there's snow coming again this weekend. And I was like, sure, we'll see it. And sure enough, it fell. So we got so much snow, I'm actually off from work tomorrow. Or at least I'll be working from home. I'm sure some of my coworkers will be trying to work remote, and I'll be there to support them as best I can. But I hope those of you kind of living in the same area as me stay warm. I hope you deal with the remaining snow and ice as best you can. And to people living in, say, Finland, where you probably have 2 or 3 feet of snow on the ground, I'm sure you're laughing at our non-snow equipped asses here in the U.S. At least where I live, we're non-snow equipped. But I hope everyone stays warm regardless, and I hope you all have a good rest of your day and week from whenever you hear this episode. And we'll see everyone next time. Peace.